Yeah, thank you. Welcome to this first plenary session. And I'm happy to welcome Paige West. Where are you, Paige? Yeah, there. Who's going to present the critical approaches to dispossession in the Melanesian Pacific, conservation, voice, and collaboration. Paige is the Clare-Tow Professor of Anthropology at Barnard College and Columbia University. Her broad scholarly interest is the relationship between societies and the environment. And then we have Nitin Rai, who is going to act as discussant. And Nitin is a fellow at the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment in India. And he uses a political ecology approach to understand the implication of state conservation policy and practice for people and landscapes. Paige, you will have 30 minutes. Or 40? 40? Okay. You see, we're very democratic in Poland. And then, Nitin, you will have 10 minutes for comments. And then we will open for some questions. And I'm going to take care of the time. So welcome, Paige.
Yeah. Oh, hello. Excellent. Good thing I wasn't singing or something. Thanks. I got it. Yeah. All right. So first of all, can everybody hear me? I sound very loud. Well, hi. Thank you all so much for inviting me to give this keynote address at the beginning of what I know is going to be a wonderful, challenging, and thought-provoking conference. And thank you so much to the organizers of POLLEN and the faculty and students at the University of Oslo who made my trip to Norway possible. I'm always honored to be asked to give a talk, and honestly, a little amazed by it still. The idea that people value what I might have to say is such an extraordinary privilege. And to be asked to talk to people here in a room full of people who do political ecology, well, that's amazing. I know of no other field that moves with such careful alacrity and grace between the structures and processes that define lives and the day-to-day poetics of how those lives are lived. So thank you again very much. So while I'm the person delivering this address, the paper is co-authored with John Eine, my long-term research partner in New Ireland, Papua New Guinea. John is, as we speak, on his way to Malaysia to deliver another co-written keynote address at the International Marine Conservation Congress. So I bring you greetings from John, who in addition to being a scholar is also an Andipik in the Tumban Society from southern New Ireland, as well as a Maringan in the Tungak Society from Laven Guy or New Hanover Island. He's what would have been called in an older kind of anthropology, a chief twice over. So while this keynote may be in my voice and the one delivered in Malaysia may be in his, our epistemic practice, our research, thinking, acting, and writing comes from collaboration. I'm going to tell you today the story of the history of our shared work and describe some of our ongoing projects. Along the way, I'll raise some challenges for the field of political ecology and for all of us as politically engaged critical scholars. I'll draw out the following threads and then hopefully tie them together at the end of the talk. So first, in most of the places in the world where we do research, national, local, and indigenous labor and knowledge production is often not valued in and of itself. It's only valued when it advances the institutional goals of external agents, agencies, and organizations. And now while political ecology is better than many fields of study when it comes to valuing non-European derived epistemic practice, I think we have work to do to co-produce a truly equitable field where a range of epistemic practices are valued and intertwined as our scholarly products. So let me say this clearly and somewhat bluntly. I believe we need to do a better job of decolonizing our field in a way that stops dispossessing people in the places we work of sovereignty over their knowledge and actually creates a field that co-produces knowledge with the people that we work with in a more robust way. Second, I want us to think carefully about the genealogies of knowledge that we produce and replicate in political ecology. And while I love you and I love this field, we're a field that valorizes and draws on scholarship done by white male scholars over other kinds of scholars, and that draws on European philosophical traditions to the exclusion of other philosophical traditions. Additionally, across the field, men are cited as making theoretical contributions and pushing the field forward, while women are characterized as producing case studies that show the effects that are theorized and analyzed by their male colleagues. These practices make our field less robust than it could and should be. Third, most of our institutions of higher learning value, reward, and promote scholars who do work that stays in the academy, and they tend to denigrate and not promote scholars who do work that's seen as applied. Our institutions also fixate on particular kinds of knowledge products, peer review papers with high impact factors, for example. Products that are read by few and that are part of a capitalist publishing machine where our labor is transformed into money for corporations. Corporations who then refuse access to this knowledge for the people that we work with and for others. This disallows for the broad circulation of our work and its reception by people who might benefit from it and who might transform lives because of it. And fourth, as a field that tracks, documents, and understands dispossession and the forms of accumulation that derive from it, we better than most understand the socio-ecological ramifications of today's increasing global disparity of power and wealth. I would go as far as to say that political ecology understands our current planetary socio-ecological crisis better than any other field. And I think this means that we have a responsibility to act and write in ways that reach widely outside of our field and outside of the academy. So let me turn to my and John Iney's intertwined histories to draw out some of these themes. So John Iney started working in marine conservation in 1983. First as a fisheries college student working with visiting scientists, next as a researcher working to document the ongoing collapse of the beach demure fishery in Papua New Guinea, and then as an employee of a major conservation organization focusing on developing community-based resource management plans for coastal fisheries across Melanesia. In all of these positions, John watched outsiders come into coastal villages with already formed research questions, already formed data collection plans, already formed conservation plans, and with very few skills that he thought necessary to understand the links between local livelihoods and to help the marine biodiversity. He also watched conservation project after conservation project fail because of the lack of communication between organizations and communities. So in 1993, he and his brother Miller and his cousin Michael, all of whom who had grown up on New Hanover Island, started a small organization, an NGO that they wanted to focus on facilitating community understanding of external marine conservation efforts and facilitating the understanding of communities, about communities of these large international NGOs. What they wanted to develop was an organization that translated between epistemological systems, those of conservation organizations and those of the people living in the places where they wanted to work. They also wanted to focus on what they called community education. So John is a really stellar marine scientist, and everywhere he looked, he saw his people from New Hanover and across the region that he lived in using marine systems in unsustainable ways. He wanted to teach people across his homeland about things like reproductive biology of beach demure, the breeding habits created by healthy mangrove forest, and the importance of seagrass for reef fish diversity. But with the understanding that this scientific knowledge always had to be in a feedback loop with already existing indigenous knowledge systems. So with initial funding from the Asian Development Bank, the three men founded Islands Awareness, the small NGO, and they developed what's become known as the Roadshow, a process where their staff went to rural communities, coastal communities, and did conservation awareness. This was what they saw as a first product for their NGO, the very first step in this much broader vision. To say that there was a frenzied buy-in from the big international organizations around this work is an understatement. Remember back to the 1990s, this was the heyday of CRBM and ICADS. Everyone wanted a local team to go out to rural sites and teach people about conservation. So John and his team got swept up in this. And they did well in terms of helping NGOs and others facilitate their projects. But their vision, that of an organization that also worked to educate outsiders, was not fulfilled. Everyone in the 1990s wanted to engage Islands Awareness to do CRBM, education, but nobody wanted to give them money to do anything else. They became, in essence, a service provider to the very kinds of projects that John, Miller, and Michael had been critical of early on. And additionally, they became a kind of cover for big international NGOs who could say to their funders, organizations that were increasingly nervous about the lack of engagement in local partners, that they had an indigenous NGO as an equal partner in their work. Yet the partnerships were increasingly unequal. Islands Awareness was only engaged to do contract work. They were never funded at a level that allowed them to adequately maintain an office, a staff, a vehicle, or a boat. All of these things that you need to be a functioning small NGO. So Islands Awareness had also gotten a reputation as a fixer for research scholars and research teams that wanted to come to New Ireland and do work. John was constantly being asked to provide logistical support for people, provide introductions to communities where people wanted to conduct research, to provide biological information about certain species and habitats where they were likely to be found, and to serve as a middleman between researchers and communities when conflicts arose. All of the scientists and social scientists who came to New Ireland collected their data and went away. They almost never returned any data to communities, and they almost never had any discussion with the communities about what kinds of findings that they had. And there was almost never any proper acknowledgement of the labor that both Islands Awareness staff and others had put into the scholarly research products. Nor was there any prior consultation with people from New Ireland about what research might be valuable to them or important to them, and what research questions they themselves had. And except for one person, a man named Matthew Leavesley, who's an archaeologist, not one single research scholar in the 1990s out of the hundreds who came had a co-author on any of their work that was from New Ireland. So this brings me to, and this is not just scientists, this is also social scientists, anthropologists, economists, lots and lots of scholars. So this brings me to my first conceptual thread. What kinds of labor and epistemic practice are valued in our field and in others? On the one hand, there's a tendency to value what's seen as local or indigenous knowledge, but on the other, there's still a tendency to see it as something to be understood and analyzed and documented, and not as an alternative form of epistemic practice that may well hold answers that are not accessible through Euro-American Australian forms of epistemic practice. There's certainly not the push to see indigenous or local epistemic practice as theoretical in nature, and thereby something we might see as supplanting or enhancing European social theory. Additionally, there's still a kind of colonized mindset in much of the scholarly research that goes on in places like Papua New Guinea. Outsiders come in, extract knowledge, benefit from the multiple forms of labor provided locally, and then benefit from all of this through the dissemination of their knowledge products. How do we, as critical political ecologists, address this? And how do we transform our field accordingly? So in early 2006, Miller, John's brother and the co-founder of Islands Awareness, died unexpectedly. And John was devastated. Everyone was. And in 2007, when I first met John, John was in mourning for Miller, and I was in mourning for my research life as I had known it. In 2005, a graduate student was gang raped at a research station about a 3-day walk from where I'd based myself for research for a decade, from 1996 to 2006, a place called the Crater Mountain Wildlife Management Area in the eastern highlands of Papua New Guinea. The fallout from that rape was extraordinary. And while I go to visit friends there yearly, and I still see people from that area, I no longer do research there. And for everyone in the room who has a long-term field site, you know what this is like to not be, or you can imagine what it's like to not be able to go and do research in your place anymore. So at the same time that I was coming to terms with never being able to do work at Crater Mountain again, John was coming to terms with the death of his brother. And we met in a parking lot and became friends. So what was going on with me at the time, in addition to having a new to come up with a new research imagination, was that in early 2006, I'd published my first book, which was about the political ecology of conservation. And I was almost finished with my second book, which was about the political ecology of commodities. And I was looking for a new project and a new site. I'm going to step back and talk about that first book a second to kind of get us into the next theme. So the first book and the papers that I published related to it focused on environmental conservation projects as they were conceptualized, funded, and staffed in North America, Europe, and Australia, and as they were carried out in places like the remote mountains of Papua New Guinea. Ethnographically, my focus was on the connections between Gimi-speaking peoples and the lands on which they and their ancestors resided, as well as the propositions about nature and culture made by conservation practitioners working on those lands. Theoretically, my early work on conservation developed two interlinked sets of arguments. The first was about how when state services and programs recede because of things like structural adjustment constraints and other various reforms, outside entities like international non-governmental organizations insert themselves into the role of state agencies and the role that those state agencies once filled. As this happens, people begin to turn to these NGOs to fill the role of the state, to provide infrastructure for medical services, transportation, education, and access to markets for products and businesses. As that happens, the NGOs become more and more entrenched in these places. People begin to lose the full right to make decisions about their ancestral lands without any interference from outside bodies, outside sources, or institutions. What we might call now, they lose indigenous sovereignty over land. The second argument was focused on the ontological divide between Gimi-speaking people and conservation practitioners. So in that early work, I analyzed neoliberalization, capitalism, and ontology, and linked them together theoretically. And I thought of my work as a theoretical engagement with political ecology and a theoretical contribution to the field. But almost immediately, in what seemed like seconds after my work was published, it became referred to as an ethnographic case study. And over the past 12 years, I've seen it referred to like that hundreds of times. I was relegated to the world of case study like almost all other women who write in our field, and almost all other people of color, not that I'm a person of color, but women and people of color are relegated to the case study realm. The other thing about that first work was that I myself had drawn almost exclusively on white Euro-American scholars in my thinking and writing. And I had replicated the very tendency that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. I fixated on a limited set of European philosophical thinkers to create a theoretical architecture. So I thought I was making this gigantic theoretical contribution. Everybody saw it as a case study, but I was really replicating what I'm critiquing now. So here's my second conceptual thread. I ask, how do we as a field value and produce knowledge through our reading, citing, and teaching of some scholars and not others? Who do we give primacy in our construction of the genealogy of the field, and why? What are the politics of regulating women's scholarship to the realm of the case study? Indeed, what are the politics of regulating or relegating anyone's scholarship to the realm of the case study? And why do predominantly white male scholars become the theoretical stars in the field? Why do they become the people that are seen as powerful theoretical thinkers? And what does this foreclose? What kinds of epistemic advances don't happen because we fail to expand our ideas about whose work matters, and what kind of work counts as theory, and what kind of work doesn't? So in conservation circles in the United States, the initial reaction to my early work on political ecology of conservation was a kind of vitriolic anger that blindsided me. But this was not the case in Papua New Guinea. In Papua New Guinea, there was a large group of Papua New Guinean and international researchers who came together in the wake of my critiques and the critiques made by Flip Van Helden and David Ellis, two other researchers that were working in the area at the time. And we came together to build something that's become known as the Papua New Guinea Institute of Biological Research, a small national NGO focused on providing opportunities for young people from Papua New Guinea who want to become scientists and anthropologists. One of our founding principles is the proposition that the conservation of biological diversity can only be achieved if indigenous people have full sovereignty over that biological diversity and sovereignty over the science that is done in their country. But here's the thing. This NGO, which became incredibly successful, that was the most important part of my scholarly life for a very long time, I never spoke about publicly, not once. I never mentioned it at all in my department, talking to my colleagues, talking at conferences, until 2010, after I got tenure. And this is the case with many people who do this kind of work. Work that is seen as applied is not valued by my institution, and I was told repeatedly if I did talk about this kind of work, I would not be promoted to professor. So this brings me to my third conceptual thread. How might we radically transform what's valued by the institutions that hire us, that fund us, that promote and tenure us? And what are the politics of an academic stance that looks down on work that is considered applied? Why are people working in this way considered less scholarly than people who are working on solely scholarly products? What is the assumption that, and why is there an assumption that projects that are attempts to affect positive change in the world are not theoretically driven? Why is there an assumption that there is a divide between practice and theory? And what, given the state of the world today and the increasing global inequality, dispossession, and oppression that we're all seeing, what are we doing if we're not doing something that is meant to transform and liberate? How can we as a field think that only writing scholarly papers and books is enough anymore? So I want to jump to the present and talk a little bit about the work that John and I are doing today. So because John and I had come to the same conclusions about research, conservation, and dispossession, we wanted to actually do some work together. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing. All of our projects are both scholarly and meant to contribute to local sovereignty, sovereignty over knowledge, territory, bodies, and representational practices. Drawing on the epistemic work of scholars like Linda Smith, David Gaggio Watson, Audre Lorde, Faye Harrison, Ukusi Mahana, and the epistemic worlds of thinkers from the Gimi world, the Tumban world, the Tungak world, and the Malagan world, we've developed a methodology that I want to turn to now. And I'm going to run through this really quickly so we have time for conversation. Basically, our methodology starts out with people coming to see us. So people come to our office, they check in, they say, hey, we know what you guys do. We know about some of your other projects. We have this problem. And that problem can be biological in nature. It can be social in nature. Basically, people come to us and tell us that they've seen a change in their livelihood patterns. They've seen a change in something that matters to them. When they come to us, we say, okay, we'll come out and have a chat with you. And so we do a sort of revised kind of roadshow from the very beginnings of Islands Awareness. We go to their place, their community, their village, their town hall, wherever they want us to go. We present about our methodology. We explain what research is to people. We explain what research can and can't do. And we focus on local epistemic practice around causality. And what I mean by that is we ask people about the problem that they see, and then we ask them what they think is going on. After that roadshow, the community and the group then spends time discussing our meeting, reflecting on what we told them that we've done in the past, and thinking about whether they want to work with us to try and understand the problem that they've identified. Sometimes they come back to us, sometimes they don't come back to us. If they return to us and they ask us to help them understand and perhaps mitigate the change or the problem they've identified, we then work with them to determine how they want us to do this. We can offer multiple forms of research. Everything from a graduate student or an undergraduate student of mine writing a really clear review of the literature about the problem and then presenting it to them, to a full-scale research project where we bring in outside scholars. We walk through this with the group talking to them about what will be involved in the research, and we outline what research will mean to everyone involved. After this, the group goes away again, and they have another round of consultation. If they agree to move forward, the next step is to do the research. And here we pull in partners, and we do the kind of research with the community that they want done, always involving the community in multiple ways. After the research has been carried out, the results are returned to the community or group. The findings are presented in another version of the roadshow, and they're discussed at length with the community. And they're presented in multiple forms. One way we present is discussions, PowerPoint presentations. Another is in focus groups or group discussions. And they're also produced in presented in multiple languages, including all of the indigenous languages that may be involved, but also including scholarly language like we would use here in this room, and also more sort of standard English explanations of what's happening. After the results are presented, we go away again and allow the group to work through the results on their own, ask any follow-up questions, and decide how to move forward. For each set of results we provide, we also provide a series of plans meant to address the changes that people have identified and their causes. We offer plans that are drawn from scientific conservation and preservation methods, plans that are drawn from historic indigenous conservation and preservation methods, and a combination of the two. If the community decides to move forward, we then move to a series of meetings about how to implement these plans. And all of this implementation is organized and carried out by the community that asked us to come in the first place. We facilitate this, but we actually don't do any of this work ourselves. And so people actually do these projects on their own. And do I have time to give examples? A couple of examples. So the first one is returning to something that John and I said we would never do again, community conservation. All of these are villages where we have community conservation areas, and I'll talk about Laven Guy Village. So Laven Guy is a big village on New Hanover Island, which is also called Lavenai in the local Tungak language. So Laven Guy has a bunch of fringing reef, and they also have a really big bay. And they realized that their fringing reef was getting hammered by overfishing, tons and tons and tons of overfishing. And they weren't exactly sure whether it was because people were not following traditional taboos. They weren't sure if it was because big pelagic fish those stocks were declining. They wanted to figure out what was going on. So we did a project with the Laven Guy people, and they wanted us to help them understand why the decline in the number of fish that they were finding. We did that with some scientists. We got some great answers. And then in mitigation, we went and said, well, so what do you want to do? There's all this literature that talks about scientific conservation of reef species. There's all of this stuff about no-take zones, light-take zones. You know, you guys know this literature. And we said there's also a huge literature on traditional fishing and traditional conservation methods. There's also an archaeological literature looking at a thing called fish traps. And so with the Laven Guy people, we figured out how to do a combination of scientific methods and traditional methods. So they now have a series of no-take zones and a series of traditional fish traps that they've revived. And they have seen a marked increase in the number of fish that they have in their communities. And all of these different places on the screen have very different conservation projects, and they're all locally designed. And every single one is a mix of traditional conservation and scientific conservation. Second thing we have, we really never thought this would come up. We have these cultural revitalization projects, and the one that I'll talk about is the Maligan project. So this is a Maligan carving. Maligan is a system, it's a social system, it's kind of a total social fact that takes people in New Ireland from birth all the way to death. And one of the things that's really important in Maligan is carving. People do these amazing carvings. About 5 years ago, the last 6 living Maligan carvers came to John and I and said, hey, you guys do this conservation work. We want you to help us figure out how to conserve Maligan carving techniques. And so working with the carvers, we came up with a plan for passing on knowledge, and it's very complicated. You can ask questions about it. But one of the things is that we brought carvers digital tools to look at carvings in global museums and talk about those and think through how to use those motifs and not motifs that are spiritually, sort of spiritually damaging. And anyway, ask me about Maligan. I could talk for hours about it, sorry. But so how to pass on motifs, and we started 6 carving schools. And so now these carvers have carving schools where they can teach both people in their own clan protected motifs, but also they can teach people that are not in their clan motifs that they got from the Digital Repatriation Project. And then finally, we have a series of projects around what we call socio-ecological stewards. The first is a thing called the Saltwater School, that's a picture of our classroom that we just built. The Saltwater School is sort of like a summer camp. We bring kids together for a couple of weeks at a time, kids all the way from kindergarten kids up through high school kids, bring them together with elders and with scientists. So we have these amazing moments. We have someone who is an expert on beach demure, which is sea cucumbers, which is a crashed fishery across the Pacific. We have a scientist, for instance, a wonderful woman named Kathy Hare, who's an expert on beach demure. And then we have Tigak elders, men and women, who are also experts on beach demure. They come together and they do a program for kids that's multiple days long. The other things that we do, we have a My Strengthening project, which is meant to strengthen the regional chiefdom system. We have a cultural exchange project where chiefs from one system get in touch with chiefs from another system. We're going to do an exchange with people from North America and people from New Guinea. And then we have interns from the college. So all of this is by, oh, and we also have John. This is John, and he made me put this slide in early this morning. So this is not me. I'm not a citizen of Papua New Guinea, and so I do not do direct action in the country. But John also does direct action against special agricultural business leases, logging, palm oil, and mining. So this is all by way of saying that as political ecologists, I think that we can do work that is socially and politically engaged, that transforms people's lives, and that is still driven by scholarly and theoretical goals. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Nitin, yep. Rai will now, do you hear me? Yes. Will now comment Paige's presentation.
Thank you.
Can you use 10 minutes?
Yeah.
So that we have some time for questions?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, this will be 10 minutes. I'm sure you're all itching to ask Paige a ton of questions. One of the books that, of the many books that I lent students and researchers, the one book that never came back, Paige, was Conservation is Our Government Now. So somebody that I know loves case studies. So Paige has laid out a slew of issues and challenges to a North-South collaborative engagement. While I let your, part of your brain process all that she said, I want to take you and highlight a few of the deep-seated inequalities within societies that influence collaboration and the work that political ecology has to do to speak to these inequalities. The intensifying levels of difference from the global to the local have implications for negotiating relationships of knowledge and power. These differences have persisted for a long time. Now, how do these inequalities influence who gets to say what and work with whom? Take, for instance, caste in India. That's where I come from. Caste pervades Indian society. Indian academia is today dominated by Brahmins and upper castes. Now, this was also a strategic colonial project to use existing hierarchies of caste to rule a population. In 1835, Thomas Macaulay infamously wrote, "We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To that class, we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles to conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population," end quote. So it naturally fell to the Brahmins, who in their characteristic self-effacing fashion noted their ability to take on the mantle of academic leadership and knowledge production. This has raised barriers to other ways of knowing, and these barriers have stayed up since. Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, in her article, Can the Subaltern Speak?, says, certain varieties of the Indian elite are at best native informants for first world intellectuals interested in the voice of the other. But one must nevertheless insist that the colonized subaltern subject is irretrievably heterogeneous, end quote. There's now a deep-seated anger that is arising from within academia with suicides and protests by Dalit students in campuses across India. A couple of months ago, the Supreme Court diluted a major legislation that was aimed to protect Dalits and Adivasis from violence by upper castes. Now, this was met with nationwide protests that were quickly quelled by the state. There's also evocative Dalit literature sharing stories of oppression. Now, Siddhalingaya is a Kannada Dalit poet whose work is very hard-hitting. He's part of a movement of Dalit poetry whose motto is, make poems our weapons. And I would like to share with you one of his poems. Now, brace yourself for some very hard language and plug your ears if you need to. The poem is titled A Song and has been translated from the original Kannada by Ramchandra Sharma. And it begins, bash them, kick them, skin these bastards alive. God is one, they claim, but build a different temple on each street. We are all God's children, they say, yet they shrink from us holeya, as if we are snakes. No entry for us to their inns, their wells, their houses, but dogs that lick our shit may share their rooms. They eat what we grow, take the sweat of our brow, they eat what it's only us people they shun. We are not Holeya and Madiga anymore, my brothers. They call us Harijan and laugh, my brothers. They hold meetings about us, draft laws for our sakes, pat each other's backs in our name. They liberate us, they declare in the papers, how they yell from their mics. Yet no school for us, my friends, only drudgery. Nor can we hold up our heads high. They're playing games with us, these bastards. So smash them, kick them, break these whoresons' bones. So that's the anger. And this was written in the 70s, and there's a lot of these kinds of protest poems that are doing the rounds. So when you have in India, as we do, a historically segregated society based on caste, the coercive nature of development and conservation gets even more entrenched. So as we think of collaboration, we think of issues on the ground that are raw. My second point is how political economy affects us all, but in different ways. So here I want to tell a little story about ATREE's work in the Bilagiri Rangaswamy Temple Tiger Reserve. The first funding came from a range of sources, all American, MacArthur Foundation, Biodiversity Conservation Network, and later the Ford Foundation. This was to increase income of Soliga Adivasis through value addition of forest produce. The Soliga were continuing to be arborealized without their knowledge, and the NGO was getting corporatized, not without our knowledge. The most recent round of funding for this kind of work is coming from USAID under a large program that includes funding for other organizations to do RED Plus implementation, for instance. There's a whole battery of programs through NGOs. So even within the same site, which is BRT, capital flows were having very different effects on actors that were presumably working together. These are difficult questions, as this concerns the very existence of institutions which need to be financed to survive. And yet they directly affect me and my colleagues and the very people that we work with. I was once told by a person who runs a research NGO in India that the work on getting Adivasi's rights to the forest was undermining his livelihood. So how do institutions that are looking to survive ever be able to speak for others? And I think that this goes for all of us, whether we're in the north or the south. We're all implicated and compromised. So how do the Soliga Adivasi respond to all of this? Right. Over the course of the last 14 years, in my conversations with Soligas, I've been touched by the practice of sense and meaning making through stories that weave together many disparate times and spaces. Ajit Menon, who's here, a collaborator of mine, and I were in BRT last year conducting fieldwork on local perspectives of state-driven economic valuation of ecosystem services. And we're there to hear what the Soligas felt about all of these. So we went to a Bhutani Podu, which is a settlement that's been identified for relocation, as it's located in critical tiger habitat. And tigers, according to the latest science, presumably cannot have sex if Adivasis are within hearing distance of their nuptial exercises. So after telling us what he actually thought of valuation, Dasegowda broke into a story of the killing of an evil king called Shravana by their god, Madeshwara. And in the middle of him recounting this, I realized that I'd read the same story before in a collection of essays on Dalit writing. And so here are excerpts from that account that will hopefully give you a sense of how empowering it is, these stories for Dalits and Adivasis. It's called The Flaming Feet, and it's translated from a medieval epic in Kannada by the same translator, Ramchandra Sharma. And it goes, when King Shravana placed an order for a palanquin of flowers, the gods as slaves made a flower palanquin. Be seated, Lord of Bankapuri, they said. When the king sat in the palanquin, they heaved it to their shoulders. Madhuri, where are the slippers? He asked. Madhuri, by the way, is a term for untouchable. And the king was using this in contempt, to show his contempt for Lord Madeshwara. You shall see them, our father replied, and asked the gods to move. He showed the king the slippers he had kept on a rock. Excellent, said the king of Bankapuri after taking a look. Step into them, your highness, Madeva said. Take 3 steps forward and 3 steps back. Try them, king. If they're tight, I'll loosen them. And if they're loose, I'll tighten them for you. As the king stepped forward and then back, our Lord Madeva took out a charmed pulse from his bag and cast it on the ground. As the king firmly placed his weight, a flame shot up from the sole of his foot. You should have heard the king scream. You should have seen our Lord. Fearsome our Lord looked in anger. Fearsome indeed he walked, our father, to where the king stood, and placed his tiny foot on the nape of King Shravana's neck and trampling him underfoot, killed him. You should have seen our Lord. You should have seen him indeed. After recounting this story, Dasegowda said that on having killed the king, the Lord instructed the Soligas to perform the last rites for the king in the BR Hills Tiger Reserve in the forest each year, right? And that was their role in the forest. And that is why they could not be relocated from the Tiger Reserve. So that was their story of their location in that forest. He said that the forest and the animals would be destroyed if these rites were not performed each year. The story has traveled amongst various communities, whether Dalit or Adivasi, and gives Dasegowda the ability to conceptualize his place in the forest. And yet there is a point today at which the story ceases to travel any further. I believe that the work that political ecologists are doing to identify the real reasons why Soligas and their stories are being alienated from the forest is extremely essential for the project of giving voice to local people. So we require the critique that's coming from the elite academic North and the South that works with the resistance and the epistemes that Paige so beautifully highlighted for us today. Thank you, and thanks to Thor and Connor for giving me the chance to come here and speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll have some time for some questions now. I would like to ask you to be brief in your questions. So I'll take 3 questions, 1, 2, and 3, and Roy will bring the microphone to you. If you could, both of you come up in case the questions are for either of you. Or I can bring the microphone to you as well.
Can you hear me? Thank you. First of all, I will never thank you enough, Dr. Paige, for mentioning and explaining this relegation of female academics to case studies. To me, this is as liberating a moment as the #MeToo movement. My question to you is, did you face, in your fieldwork, did you face the problem that we see in our case studies, in our fieldwork, where the academics, the local indigenous, quote-unquote, academics, have been educated in the West and have completely swallowed the values and the epistemic approaches of the West, and so are at loggerheads with the very people you want to work with and actually accuse you of colonialism?
Back there. Can you please stand up?
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. My name is Lena Patch from the University of Freiburg, and we do a lot of, in Germany and the Black Forest area, we do a lot of research, applied research around the town of Freiburg with people. And I wonder if you could say also something about the limits of this work. We call it transition research. Because I often feel it's a waste of time for us because we don't get publications out of it, and also sometimes it's a waste of time for the communities because they just come to please us, basically. And then we need to write reports and write how great everything is, and also give talks like yours. I don't want to say you do this, but say how great everything was, but actually it's not all great, and sometimes it would be better to just get normal research budgets, I think, instead of doing applied research. Yeah, I wonder what your opinion is on this.
The third one, can you please stand up? Thank you.
Congratulations for your beautiful talk. I'm working in Brazil. I'm Brazilian, and I work in an university teaching to black students. And I saw that you were very careful to position yourself in your research. This is something that I find that it's key to decolonize political ecology. And I would like to ask you if you could talk a bit more, how do you engage with this other knowledge epistemologically and also ontologically, let's say, how can you bridge these other words? Because I think I believe that this is a fight that you have to have in academia, because it's not only like you as American women that get disrespected to not talk theoretically, but more than that, it's the othering that their knowledge are being destroyed more than not being recognized.
Thank you, please. Okay, hello, can you guys hear me? Okay, do I need to put it on? I want to make a joke about Madonna because it always makes me think of Madonna, but then it ages me because none of the young people will understand it. Okay. So the first question, well, I'm glad that you felt resonance with, I'm sad that you felt resonance, but I'm glad that you did, and I hope that, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is what I can do as a senior, super structurally privileged person to speak out about this stuff and to actually call people out on it. And so this talk is one of the first times I've ever done it publicly, so thanks for saying that. In terms of local academics, one of the things that we found more with the Papua New Guinea Institute of Biological Research than with the work with John was that local academics who are trained in the biological sciences in North America and in Australia, which is where most people from Papua New Guinea are trained, are just as unwilling to engage with local indigenous folks and use the same sorts of structural power to disempower those people. And so one of the things that we've done at PNG-IBR, which I think has been kind of successful in some cases, kind of not successful, but it's been really interesting, is we do these open classes. And so we do classes where we invite people who are already PhD'd or already working at NGOs to come and learn about some of the things that we do. And so we do a class on decolonizing methodology with local academics and work through with them how it is that, there's all this great literature on the colonized mind, right? We work through that literature with people who do the kinds of things that you talked about. But yeah, we absolutely see it. And our way of countering it is to say, okay, how do we help people produce more knowledge about this locally, but also how do we help these scholars understand that there's a world of work that's been done about this? In terms of the Freiburg question, so there's certainly limits to applied work, and the thing is, I don't talk about applied work. I mention it in this talk because I think that's what this kind of work gets called. I don't think about this work as applied. I think about this work as academically, theoretically driven work that happens to have a positive outcome in the world. I think that the thing that we do to make it seem not a waste of time is we actually transform the structures of academic reward. And I think that's a big call, and I think that all the people, so everybody in the room who has a tenured academic position, raise your hand up high. So I'm looking at you right now. I mean, one of the things we have to do is transform what our institutions actually promote. We have to transform what our institutions value. Because if your school is anything like my school, the vast majority of our PhDs and master's students are not going to get academic jobs. They're going to get other kinds of jobs. And so why are we not actually valuing the sorts of knowledge products that those people are going to be producing? In terms of whether things are always great, absolutely not. In addition to the wonderful stories that I could tell you about the work we've done in New Ireland, I can tell you about some terrible stuff-ups that we've had. Times when communities have come exactly for the reasons that you said, because other people in the community sort of bullied them into doing it, because they felt like it was the right thing to do, because there was a sense that we could, partially because of my white skin, that we could mobilize economic resources that they couldn't mobilize themselves. We really try to help people understand that that's not the right reason to work with us, but we're not always successful. And then in terms of bridging other conceptual theoretical worlds, you know, one of the things that I think I didn't make I wasn't pointed enough about in my talk was this position of privilege that I sit in as a North American academic tenured at a super elite institution. I mean, I have the best job in the world and am protected in a way that is incredible. And also, as much as I don't like being relegated to the world of the case study, are people telling me that I'm a beautiful writer, which is lovely, except what it actually means is that it's easy for me to do that. It's somehow not work, right? And so all those things make me crazy, and I bring them out and talk about them because I know that people like you and other scholars from the global south have it 20,000 times worse than me. And so I want us to talk about this really openly. I want us to talk about it in our classrooms. I want us to talk about it at meetings like this. Whose knowledge counts? And particularly given the state of the world today and the fact that the state of the world derives from the same epistemic processes that led to the theoretical worlds that we privilege in political economy, how can we actually transform the world with those same kinds of epistemic processes? And one of the things that we try to do really, really, really hard, John and I, is think about contemporary theoretical work coming from my discipline of anthropology and contemporary theoretical work coming from the elders. So for example, Tegak elders. When we talk to them about things, we try really hard, and we're not always super successful, to say they're theorizing the world, they're explaining the world through a set of arguments about how things come to be and how things can come to be in a different way, just like academic theorists are. And so we try to bring those two things together, and that really is partially what the Saltwater School is about. You know, we focus on children because you can get money for children, but one of the things that we do is really say, okay, when you have these scientists and social scientists coming together with elders, how does knowledge transform when you have multiple kinds of knowledge treated on equal footing together?
Thank you. So if there's one last question, but if not, we'll close the, okay, two. Can you two please stand up?
Hi, I'm Ruth Elliot Blomqvist from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And this is not so much a question for you as a kind of general comment on the first three speakers, which maybe you would want to comment on in any case. The human ecologist Alf Hornborg has developed a